Pesto reflected her orderly nature, political documents neatly stacked on her home office desk, and her court attire always prepared the night before. Karoline wasn't heading to the White House, where she typically wielded authority as President Donald Trump's spokesperson. Instead, she needed to address a minor personal matter at the Pesto Municipal Court, a contract dispute involving her family's used truck dealership, which she believed had been misunderstood. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Karoline opted for a more casual outfit than usual, a neat navy blue blazer over a white blouse and black pants. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, she carefully tied back her hair, the natural blonde locks she'd always taken pride in. At 27, her face radiated the determination forged from years working alongside Trump and self-studying law through campaign documents. Just a quick court appearance, she told herself, grabbing a banana and a thermal mug filled with fresh coffee. Her BMW, a reward she'd given herself for contributing to Trump's election victory, waited in the garage. The car was her pride and joy, though she sometimes noticed surprised looks from strangers seeing a young woman step out of such an expensive vehicle. Morning traffic in Pesto moved slowly. Karoline wasn't worried. She'd left plenty of time to reach the courthouse. She turned on NPR, listening to the morning news while mentally reviewing her paperwork for the contract dispute. The issue stemmed from a truck maintenance contract her family had signed with a local company, but the payment terms conflicted with the actual invoice. She'd taken photos of the related documents to support her case. Suddenly, her car's Bluetooth system signaled an incoming call. The screen displayed the caller, Michael Reynolds, a senior political advisor at the White House. Karoline's heart raced. A direct call from him usually meant something urgent. "Karoline, sorry for calling early." Michael's voice came through the speakers. "We've got an issue with the President's Gulf of America's decree. The press is going wild, and I need you to review a response right away." Karoline gripped the steering wheel tighter. The decree renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America was one of Trump's most controversial policies, and she was its media point person. "Yes, how long do I have to respond?" she asked. "Before noon today. I'm emailing you the documents now. Can you review them and call me back?" "Sure," Karoline replied, her tone professional despite her mind already racing. She'd planned to arrive at the courthouse early to find the right courtroom, but now she'd need to pull over somewhere to handle this. Karoline found a parking spot near a small coffee shop. She pulled out her laptop, connected to her phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the documents Michael had sent. The press questions were tough, requiring sharp, legally grounded responses to defend the decree. She took detailed notes, determined to craft a perfect reply. Time slipped by as she analyzed each point. When she glanced at her watch, she jolted. It was nearly court time, and the courthouse was still a 10-minute drive away. She quickly called Michael back, briefly discussed her thoughts, and promised a fuller response after her court appearance. Back in traffic, Karoline tried to stay calm. She'd never been late to a press briefing or event. It went against everything she stood for. But she also knew her role as White House press secretary didn't allow her to ignore critical duties. The Gulf of America issue could impact Trump's image and millions of his supporters, and that morning's response was pivotal in shaping public perception. Finally, she pulled into the Pesto Municipal Court parking lot a few minutes behind schedule. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed with a thank you message from Michael Reynolds. "Your quick analysis was spot on. Thanks for prioritizing this." Karoline allowed herself a small smile. At least the delay had served an important purpose. But what she didn't realize as she rushed up the courthouse steps with her paperwork in hand was that arriving a few minutes late was about to spark a chain of events that would expose deep-seated biases in a system she'd never imagined confronting. Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom awaited her, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom was known for its strict rules and cold efficiency. At 62, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried an air of authority built over 30 years on the bench. That morning, he sat elevated above the room, his black robe pressed and pristine, watching people file into the courtroom. The municipal courtroom was already bustling with over 20 individuals seated on the wooden benches, most there for minor issues: traffic tickets, contract disputes, or administrative matters. Grayson noted that most early arrivals were neatly dressed, their paperwork in order, and he nodded approvingly at their punctuality. "All rise," the the bailiff, Robert Hayes, called out as the session began. Judge Grayson launched into his familiar routine with practiced precision, handling the first few cases swiftly and efficiently, proud of running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. To him, tardiness was a sign of disrespect for the law. When the courtroom door swung open a few minutes after the start, Karoline Leavitt slipped in quietly, trying not to disrupt the proceedings. But Judge Grayson halted mid-sentence in another case, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the young woman who dared arrive late. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and icy. The case in progress was set aside. Karoline approached the podium, her posture confident and professional despite the hostile reception. Grayson glanced down at his schedule. "You must be Karoline Leavitt, scheduled for the start of this session," he said, emphasizing the timing with a tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's, Miss Leavitt?" Before she could respond, Grayson pressed on, his voice growing louder with each sentence, intent on making an example of her. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Earlier, a middle-aged businessman had arrived a few minutes late, and the judge had barely noticed. "In this courtroom, we have rules," Grayson lectured, shuffling papers on his desk without glancing at Karoline. "This isn't a White House press briefing or some media event where you can stroll in whenever you please. This is a court of law." Karoline stood still at the podium, hands clasped in front of her, calmly observing. She noticed he hadn't even looked at her paperwork yet. His arrogance was evident in every gesture. He regarded her as if she were just an inexperienced young woman, speaking to her like she was a child. Robert Hayes, an older man, watched the scene with a hint of unease. In his 15 years there, he'd seen Grayson treat those who didn't fit his mold differently. "Your Honor, may I explain?" Karoline began, her voice steady and professional. "You may not," Grayson cut her off, his tone firm as if to squash any resistance. Judge Edward Grayson interrupted Karoline. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergencies. None of that matters here." "The session was set to start on time," he said, lifting his gavel as if its mere presence underscored his authority. Those awaiting their cases watched intently. A young woman in a business suit, who'd arrived a few minutes before Karoline, sat silently, her tardiness completely overlooked. A pattern of unfairness was becoming apparent to everyone in the courtroom, though Grayson himself seemed oblivious to it. "This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedure," Grayson continued, his face flushing slightly as his authority was challenged by Karoline's composure. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality." Karoline remained steadfast at the podium, maintaining her professionalism. She'd faced dismissal in her career before, from journalists skeptical of her youth to political rivals belittling her role beside Trump. But this was different, a blatant abuse of power unfolding publicly within the very legal system she'd respected from afar. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Other defense attorneys watched with a mix of empathy and concern. The court clerk, Mrs. Margaret Evans, a middle-aged woman who'd worked with Grayson for years, grew increasingly uneasy as she typed the proceedings into her computer. What Grayson didn't realize, as he prepared to pronounce his penalty, was that his next words would set off a chain of events challenging not just his authority, but revealing Karoline's unexpected prowess. The morning's real shock was still to come. Grayson leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his expression stern as he prepared to deliver his ruling. Morning sunlight streamed through the courtroom's tall windows, casting harsh shadows across his face, enhancing his imposing demeanor. "Miss Leavitt," he declared, his voice echoing through the now silent room, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt." He paused, letting the amount sink in. It was one of the steepest fines he'd issued for lateness, though he didn't mention that. Karoline stood motionless at the podium, her mind swiftly cataloging every detail of this exchange. She noticed Grayson's eyes never quite met hers, his tone carrying an edge she'd encountered too often in her political career, a blend of arrogance and prejudice toward her youth. From her time with Trump, she'd honed a knack for spotting self-importance disguised as authority. Mrs. Margaret Evans entered the fine into the system with hesitant fingers. In her 12 years there, she felt uneasy enough to jot a private note about this in her log. Just the previous week, a middle-aged attorney had arrived 20 minutes late without explanation and received only a mild reprimand. "Furthermore," Grayson went on, seemingly emboldened by Karoline's silence, "let this serve as a lesson in responsibility." He lifted a sheet of paper, pretending to read, though it was clearly for show. The legal system runs on order and respect. Without punctuality, we'd have chaos. Among the onlookers, reactions varied. The young woman in the suit checked her watch, recalling her own unnoticed delay. An elderly local shook his head slightly, all too familiar with Grayson's treatment of those outside his standards. Robert Hayes maintained his professional stance near the judge's bench, but his jaw tightened noticeably. In 15 years, he'd quietly noted such injustices, though he'd never spoken up. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath. She'd faced far tougher situations, from fielding sharp questions in White House press rooms to defending Trump against fierce political criticism. But this was different. It was personal, yet it stood for something greater than herself. She carefully pulled out her phone and noted the fine's amount and details. Additionally, Judge Edward Grayson continued, his tone growing stricter, like a disciplinarian, "You'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you late on that too, would we?" A few nervous chuckles rose from the gallery, quickly stifled by the tense atmosphere. The morning sun had shifted now, illuminating Karoline's face as she stood at the podium. She remained professional, but her eyes held a resolve that a shrewder judge might have hesitated to confront. She'd spent years sharpening her mind through late nights, studying legal documents with Trump's advisors, gathering insights and preparing for any scenario. Now, unwittingly, Grayson was handing her every tool needed to expose bias in his courtroom. "Do you understand the fine as I've explained it?" Grayson asked, his tone implying he expected meek compliance. When Karoline finally spoke, her voice was clear and measured. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely," she replied, each word carefully chosen, her tone betraying none of her thoughts. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response was to document everything and wait for the right moment. Grayson nodded, satisfied with what he took as submission to his authority. He reached for the next case file, ready to move on as if he hadn't just displayed the very bias that tarnished the legal system. He didn't notice Karoline's meticulous record of his words, tone, and disparate treatment of defendants. He didn't see her quickly type a short message to her White House team, oblivious that his fleeting moments of presumed authority were about to become evidence in a broader fight for justice. The courtroom remained taut as Grayson prepared to proceed. But Karoline wasn't done. In fact, she was just beginning. The next few minutes would shake the foundations of the tightly controlled world Grayson had built, and he didn't see it coming. The moment Karoline opened her briefcase, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook where she'd kept legal notes from Trump campaign meetings, the morning light catching the densely written pages. Grayson had already turned his focus to the next case, assuming their exchange was over. He was mistaken. "Your Honor," Karoline's voice rang out with newfound authority, halting everyone in the room. "Before we proceed, I need to clarify something for the record." She held up her notebook, its detailed legal precedents from her late-night studies plain to see. "I am Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary, and though I'm not here as a lawyer, I have enough legal knowledge to contest this court's ruling." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Grayson's face, flushed with authority moments earlier, drained of color. His hand, reaching for the next file, froze midair. The room fell so silent that the old ceiling fan's gentle hum suddenly seemed loud. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Baith Robert Hayes couldn't hide a subtle smile. In his 15 years, he'd seen much in this courtroom, but this moment would stick with him forever. Grayson started, then faltered. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at Karoline. Not just her youth or political role, but her professional demeanor, her impeccable blazer, and most crucially, the confidence in her legal acumen. "I apologize for my delay this morning," Karoline Leavitt continued, her voice steady and clear. "I was delayed by an urgent matter from the White House regarding the Gulf of America's decree, which I'm sure Your Honor has heard about in the news." She paused briefly to let her words sink in. "I have an email confirmation from political advisor Michael Reynolds, and I'm happy to provide it to the court if needed." The young woman in the suit, who'd arrived late earlier, sank lower in her seat, feeling like she was watching a movie unfold. An elderly local in the gallery sat up straighter, pride flashing in his eyes. This was a rare sight in his lifetime. Judge Edward Grayson's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. Miss Leavitt, he fumbled with papers on his desk, looking diminished in his elevated chair. "If I'd known your role." "My role shouldn't matter, Your Honor," Karoline interjected, firm yet respectful. What matters is fairness in applying the law. She placed her notebook on the podium and pulled out her phone. I've noted several concerning points from this morning's proceedings, including the unequal treatment of defendants based on their age and reputation. Grayson's face shifted, then faintly green. As a municipal judge, he knew a figure like Karoline, with her sharp intellect and White House ties, could spell serious trouble. His mind raced, re-examining the morning through a new lens. Perhaps, he said hastily, we could discuss this in chambers. And of course, the fine is dismissed. No, Your Honor, Karoline replied, her voice carrying the weight of every time she'd faced dismissal in her career. Dismissing the fine just because of who I am would only reinforce the bias I'm addressing. Instead, I believe this is a chance for a broader conversation about fairness in the law. The other defendants watched in awe, many clutching phones despite rules against recording. This was a moment they'd recount to their kids. The day a young woman stood up to challenge the biases they'd felt but rarely proved. Mrs. Margaret Evans typed faster than ever, determined to capture every word of this historic exchange. She'd seen Grayson berate countless defendants over the years, but never had she witnessed such a powerful, precise challenge to his authority. The morning sun now flooded the courtroom, lighting the scene like a stage under a spotlight. Grayson sat in his chair, his authority crumbling, while Karoline stood tall at the podium, transforming from a defendant into a symbol of exceptional intellect before everyone's eyes. The next words in this courtroom would lay the groundwork for a shift beyond Plato's small court, a personal victory illuminating Karoline's brilliance. The minor contempt dispute had become something far greater, a moment of strength no one could ignore. The fallout from Karoline Leavitt's defiance rippled through Grayson's courtroom like a slow-motion earthquake. His immediate backpedaling was obvious to all. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat repeatedly, and adjusted his glasses, clear signs of mounting unease. "Leavitt," Grayson said, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Allow me to be the first to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button to summon his clerk. "We'll strike this fine from the record at once." Karoline remained at the podium, her stance upright and professional. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice firm yet measured, "I respectfully decline to have the fine dismissed." Her words sparked murmurs throughout the courtroom. "Instead, I'd like to address the larger issue at hand," Karoline Leavitt continued. The other defendants leaned forward, riveted. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the clerk, stopped typing entirely, her fingers frozen above the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. BFF Robert Hayes edged closer to the courtroom center, sensing the historic weight of the moment. "This morning," Karoline went on, pulling out her phone where she'd taken notes, "I observed 7 people enter this courtroom after the session began. Of those, 3 were middle-aged professionals who received no comment or reprimand from the bench." She paused, letting the facts settle. 2 were young students who got verbal warnings. And 2, including myself, faced the harshest treatment, likely due to our youth or reputation. Judge Edward Grayson's face reddened again, this time from embarrassment rather than authority. "Miss Leavitt, what you're saying amounts to very serious accusations." His voice wavered slightly. "I assure you this court treats everyone equally." "The evidence suggests otherwise, Your Honor," Karoline replied calmly. She turned slightly to address the whole room. "In fact, I've already sent a detailed note about this to my team at the White House. As someone working in the administration, I have a duty to point out any biased behavior in our legal system." A young law student seated at the back scribbled furiously. This was the kind of real-world legal drama no textbook could teach. The elderly local, who'd watched from the start, wiped a tear from his eye, recalling his own past experiences of unfair treatment. "What exactly are you proposing?" Grayson asked, his confidence seeming to erode with each passing second. The morning sunlight through the windows now felt like an interrogating beam on his face. Karoline placed both hands on the podium, her voice clear and purposeful. "I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor. First, I'll pay the $500 fine, not because it's fair, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings." She raised 2 fingers. "Second, I request that you review the past 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, focusing on patterns and how defendants are treated." Grayson's face paled as she went on. "And third, I suggest mandatory bias awareness training for all court personnel, including the bench." The courtroom was silent, but the air crackled with energy. Mrs. Margaret Evans resumed typing, determined to record every word of this exchange. Robert Hayes nodded slightly. He'd seen countless similar situations go unchallenged. These proposals, Grayson began, attempting to regain some control, though well-intentioned, seem rather extreme for a simple case of tardiness. With all due respect, Your Honor, Karoline responded. What's extreme is the persistent pattern of bias in our courts. From my experience working with President Trump, I've seen how these small issues pile up into major barriers to justice. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a check. I'll pay the fine now, and my team will follow up regarding the court records, she said, her voice free of anger or resentment. Just the professional tone of someone who knew how to challenge injustice from within the system. The morning sun now filled the courtroom, illuminating every corner. Grayson sat in his high chair, but he no longer looked imposing. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone present knew they were witnessing not just Karoline's personal triumph, but a moment affirming her exceptional talent. By late afternoon that day, the story of what happened in Grayson's courtroom spread like wildfire through New Hampshire's legal and political communities. It all started with a text from a young law student to her friends. Just saw the White House press secretary take down a judge in court. Unbelievable. The young law student, who'd witnessed it all, texted her study group. Just saw something incredible at Plateau Municipal Court. The White House press secretary humbled a judge with her legal skills. You won't believe it. Karoline Leavitt sat in her White House office, reviewing documents related to the Gulf of America decree, when her phone began buzzing nonstop. First came calls from political colleagues in New Hampshire. They wanted to share their own stories of facing Judge Edward Grayson. Many had stayed silent for years, fearing that speaking out would harm their careers. This isn't just about me, Karoline told her colleague, David Parker, a Trump campaign advisor, as he stopped by her office. For every young person like me treated this way, imagine how many regular folks suffer quietly. She showed him the growing list of messages from politicians and journalists across the state. Meanwhile, in the Plateau courthouse break room, Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, chatted with other staff. I've been keeping my own records, she admitted, pulling a small notebook from her desk drawer. Every time I saw something off, I wrote it down, dates, names, fines, everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she shared the information she'd kept secret for years. By early evening, local news stations picked up the story. Reporter Jonathan Lee from Channel 7 News stood outside the courthouse, his crew setting up for the evening broadcast. Sources inside the courthouse confirmed the White House press secretary was fined $500 for arriving late this morning, he reported. But what happened next has sparked a statewide debate about bias in our legal system. The story quickly spread to social media. Hashtags like #Grayson and #LegalGenius trended in New Hampshire. People shared their experiences with Grayson, and a clear pattern emerged. Former defendants posted about harsh treatment in his courtroom, often tied to their youth or roles. That evening, Grayson sat at home watching the news with growing dread. His phone had been ringing all afternoon. Calls from fellow judges, the state judicial board, and reporters seeking comment. He'd served on the bench for 30 years, and now his entire career was under scrutiny. Karoline's office phone rang again, this time from Emily Carter, a prominent New Hampshire journalist. We've been trying to document these biases for years, Emily said. But coming from someone like you, the White House press secretary, who experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you speak at a press conference tomorrow? At the Plateau Municipal Court's filing office, staff were already pulling Grayson's old case records. They whispered among themselves as they noticed patterns in his fines and rulings. One clerk found that, over the past year, younger defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines in his courtroom than older ones for the same violations. By nightfall, national news outlets took notice. New Hampshire judge faces scrutiny after finding White House press secretary, one headline read. Unexpected legal talent shines in New Hampshire courtroom, another announced. Social media erupted with discussions about age bias in the legal system, with Karoline's experience as a prime example. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, got several calls from colleagues that night. We've all seen things like this, he told them. This time, someone with influence saw it too, and she didn't let it slide. He recalled the times he'd watched similar scenes unfold, powerless to act. Late that night, Karoline sat in her home office, sifting through hundreds of messages she'd received. Political organizations invited her to speak at events. Media groups asked her to help document similar cases. Law schools invited her to guest lecture on confronting systemic bias. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. This was no longer just about one judge or one incident. It had grown into something much bigger, a catalyst for change in a system desperately needing reform. As she worked, her phone buzzed with another message. It was from a young law student. "Thank you for showing us we can change the system from within. You've given us hope." A week after the incident, the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee launched a formal investigation into Judge Edward Grayson's conduct. The large conference room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building buzzed with activity as investigators pored over thousands of court records from the past 5 years. Laura Bennett, the lead investigator with 20 years of experience, spread dozens of files across the long wooden table. Her team worked tirelessly, analyzing every case Grayson had handled. The patterns they uncovered were undeniable. "Look at these numbers," Laura told her team, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop. In minor contract disputes, defendants under 30 were fined an average of $400, while older defendants paid $120 for the same issues. She pushed her glasses up inside, and that's just the start. A few steps away, in a small interview room, Mrs. Margaret Evans sat nervously with her notebook in front of her. For 12 years, she documented every troubling incident she'd seen in Grayson's courtroom. Now, she finally had the chance to share them. "I noticed the pattern my first year as his clerk," she told the investigators, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her notebook. The way he spoke to people varied, his tone, his words, even the time he gave them to explain. It all depended on their age or role. The investigation expanded beyond fines. The team interviewed dozens of former defendants, lawyers, and court staff. Robert Hayes, the BFF, provided a handwritten statement detailing hundreds of incidents he'd observed over his 15 years. "Some days, I'd count how often the judge interrupted younger defendants compared to older ones," he wrote. The difference was staggering. Young defendants were interrupted 5 times more on average. Meanwhile, at the White House, Karoline continued her routine work preparing media responses for Trump. But her office became a hub for people wanting to share their stories. Young advisors brought records of their experiences, and community activists provided documentation of long-ignored complaints. "We need to organize all this information," Karoline told her assistant, eyeing the growing pile of evidence on her desk. "Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one judge. It's about reshaping how we view justice." The investigation team uncovered more troubling patterns. Young women received the highest fines on average. Cases involving defendants under 35 were processed 40% faster than those with older individuals. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for younger people. Witnesses defending young defendants were interrupted more frequently. Grayson was summoned for questioning multiple times. Each session revealed more about his unconscious biases. When confronted with the data, he seemed genuinely shocked, apparently never having realized the extent of his prejudice. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said in one interview, his voice quieter than his usual courtroom demeanor. I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to grasp the impact of his actions. The investigation also revealed that several other judges in the area showed similar patterns in their rulings. What began as a probe into one judge's conduct had exposed a systemic issue far beyond Plato's courtroom. By the end of the 3rd week, Laura Bennett and her team completed a comprehensive report. The 300-page document was packed with statistics, testimonies, and detailed analysis of thousands of cases. The evidence was overwhelming. "This report doesn't just highlight isolated incidents," Laura explained to the committee board, placing the hefty document on the conference table. "It reveals a systemic bias pattern that's affected thousands of lives over years. More importantly, it shows how this bias operates so quietly that even those perpetuating it might not fully recognize their actions." As the investigation neared its end, one thing became crystal clear. Karoline Leavitt's experience had pried open a door sealed shut for decades. Behind it lay years of recorded bias, discrimination, and inequity, waiting to be exposed and addressed. The question now wasn't just about Grayson's fate, but how to fix a system that had let such bias thrive unchecked for so long. The next steps demanded more than discipline. They required a complete reimagining of how justice was served in New Hampshire's courts. 3 months after Karoline stepped into Grayson's courtroom, the face of justice in Plato began to shift. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the main courthouse as workers installed a new sign, Center for Judicial Training and Fairness. Grayson no longer sat on the bench. After the investigation's findings, he was given a choice: resign or face a public hearing. He chose resignation. But that wasn't the end of his story. In an unexpected twist, he became part of the solution. "I never saw my own bias," Grayson told a group of judges at the first mandatory training session. He stood at the podium, a different man from the one who'd fined Karoline. His voice was humbler, his posture less rigid. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same, but I never examined how my background and assumptions shaped my rulings." Karoline sat at the back of the training room, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't anticipated this outcome when she stood up in that courtroom 3 months earlier. Beside her sat Mrs. Margaret Evans, now promoted to head a new court monitoring program. The changes rippled beyond one courthouse. New rules mandated detailed records of fines, rulings, and judicial conduct, reviewed monthly by an independent committee of community members, legal experts, and activists. Robert Hayes, the BFF, was appointed to lead a new training program for court staff. "We're the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told his first class of trainees. "It's our duty to speak up when we see unfairness." The days of staying silent are over. At the White House, Karoline looked at the wall where she'd framed her $500 fine receipt. It had become a symbol of change, reminding visitors that one person's stand could make a difference. Below it hung a new photo of her with a group of law students. She now taught a weekly class on ethics and bias in the legal system. The local bar association established a new reporting system for documenting bias incidents. In its first month, it received over 200 reports, each thoroughly investigated, painting a clear picture of existing issues and solutions. "It's not just about punishing wrongdoing," Karoline Leavitt explained to a reporter during an interview. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Everyone who walks into a courtroom deserves respect, regardless of age, gender, or role." The changes weren't confined to Plato. Other New Hampshire cities adopted similar reforms: mandatory bias awareness training for court staff, regular audits of rulings for fairness, community oversight committees to monitor court practices, and new guidelines to standardize fines and rulings. Law schools also mandated diversity training for students. One morning, 3 months after the incident, Karoline received a letter. It was from the young law student who'd seen it all that day in court. The student wrote that the moment had altered her career path. She now focused on social justice law. "You showed me change is possible," the letter read. "Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" She'd started a legal clinic at her law school to aid those facing court discrimination. The elderly local from that day returned to visit the courthouse. He walked slowly through the halls, noting the changes. Multilingual signs welcoming visitors, a help desk offering free legal guidance, and security greeting everyone equally. "I've been coming here for 40 years, he told a young clerk at the desk, his eyes welling up. "This is the first time I felt justice might truly be fair." Karoline's phone buzzed with a message. The Judicial Review Board wanted her to lead a new commission on court reform. As she read it, she recalled that morning 3 months ago. A small act of standing up for what was right had sparked a wave of change, still growing. In the Plato Courthouse's main lobby, a new plaque was installed. It read, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below was the day Karoline Leavitt entered Edward Grayson's courtroom and changed everything. The story, "Judge finds Karoline Leavitt, only to discover she's a legal genius," mirrors real issues in today's United States, particularly biases around youth, gender, and professional roles common in workplaces, including the legal system. In the tale, Karoline, a 27-year-old White House press secretary, is dismissed by Judge Edward Grayson when she arrives late to Plato Court due to an urgent task tied to the Gulf of America decree. Grayson fines her $500, mocking her as a media person ignorant of law, only to be stunned when she counters with sharp self-taught legal knowledge, exposing his unfair treatment of younger defendants. The event spreads on social media with hashtags like #LegalGenius, leading to reforms like bias training and court oversight, a reflection of America's current push for accountability and equity. The lesson here isn't just about resisting injustice. It's about turning adversity into a chance to prove your worth and drive change, even in rigid systems. Karoline didn't lean on her title. She relied on her intellect and preparation, like her detailed notes and legal precedents studied with Trump's team, to flip the script. This reminds us that in today's U.S., where social media and news can amplify one voice, knowledge and confidence are key. Her actions led to the Plateau courthouse plaque. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat each person. A practical call that every American, young or without traditional clout, can make a difference. Learn from Karoline. Don't let bias define you. Use your skills to shape a fairer society, one step at a time. Subscribe now to catch more inspiring stories like Karoline Leavitt's courtroom triumph. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video for more tales of justice and unexpected brilliance.